Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the webinar, Save Time and Speed Up Image Processing and Analysis with ENVI Server. Ooh, that's a tongue twister. My name's Bill, and I'm part of the product management team at L3Harris Geospatial. There's a couple of housekeeping items I want to mention before we get started. The phone lines are muted, so if you have any questions in the GoToWebinar questions chat box, you can type in any questions that you may have, and at the end of the presentation, we'll try to answer as many as we can. We are also recording this webinar, and we'll have it up on our website in the next couple of days. So we will send you an email with a link to the recording on our website, as well as the slide deck from the presentation, and you're welcome to share those slides with any of your colleagues. So that's the fine print, and now I want to introduce Zach. He's our presenter today. Zach is a fellow product manager here at L3Harris, and his previous background was as a sales engineer. Zach brings a real technical flair to the presentation, so there'll be lots of good information and demonstration content here. So with that, Zach, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, and thanks for the introduction, Bill. I forgot to switch to this slide while you were doing the intro. There's Bill and I, but you can see us right now with the webcams, hopefully. So there's our contact information. If anybody has questions, feel free, as Bill said, to use the questions chat box. If you have something that comes up afterwards, feel free to reach out to us. We're accessible. Or you can talk to your account manager or local distributor, and they can help answer questions or get you in touch with us as well. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. So here's a look at what we've got for our content today. We're going to have kind of a quick introduction to cover what ENVI Server is. We're going to focus on 4 use cases for ENVI Server today as we're going through the presentation. So we're going to have we're going to show the use case and then talk about it with ENVI Server and how we can solve that. Our first one is going to include a live demo. Some of this content, as you see from the little picture and comment on the right-hand side of this slide, is similar, but it is different from the What's New webinar. So if you're interested in everything else that's coming with ENVI 5.6 and a slightly different take on ENVI Server, feel free to check out the What's New webinar. Bill and I also presented that one just a couple of weeks ago. So lots of great content with this release, and ENVI Server is really what we're going forward with. It's kind of our primary feature, and so that's why we've got this second webinar here to kind of make a splash. And before we get started, we will be at about 30 minutes here today, so that's the length of our webinar. And so we might be a few minutes over. It depends on how quick I talk. So with that, let's go ahead and jump on in. So really, just to get started and keep things fun and interesting, we've got this nice little cartoon graphic here. And if you already have ENVI 5.6 and you've looked through the help content, this might look familiar. But really, at a high level, we just want to take a step back and talk about what ENVI Server is in case you haven't heard of it or aren't quite sure why it should matter. ENVI Server really does 2 things for you. First, it lets you run processing in the background and do processing in parallel in desktop ENVI. And that's what you'll see kind of in the middle graphic here on this slide is our analyst, maybe it's Jane, the scientist who uses ENVI. She's happy because she gets to keep using ENVI, doing other things, looking at imagery while she's processing in the background. The second thing that ENVI Server allows you to do as well is you can connect to other instances of ENVI Server from within ENVI. So ENVI itself is a client to ENVI Server. So this means that if you've got other machines that you've got access to and you've got access to the same data as they have, and those machines have access to the same data you have access to, then you can send processing to other computers. So this is a great way to really plow through lots and lots of imagery, mounds of data, and really reduce the amount of time that it takes to do that. So you can see some other little things across the top of the slide, other benefits, and we will cover all of those as we're going through our content today. But first, just to cover kind of our use cases, this is what we're going to be going through. We're going to fill out each one of those boxes with some text as we go along today. So don't worry about reading ahead at this point in time. We'll take a stop at each one. But before we really dig into this, we just want to show a couple of slides that show how you can access ENVI Server from within ENVI and what some of the interactions look like. And you will see this slide here for a demo here in just a few minutes. But when you're actually accessing ENVI Server, there's two very easy, very convenient ways that you can run processing in the background on your computer. So first, if you look at the image up on the top on the right-hand side of this slide, it's within the ENVI modeler. So in the ENVI modeler, there's a little arrow that's a drop down. It's got a red box around it, and it has a run model and background. Same goes for any ENVI task dialog. So I'll show what a couple of those look like here in just a few minutes as well. But on the bottom image, you'll see a little arrow drop down with a red box around it as well, which says run task in the background. So the nice thing is it's very easy to access ENVI Server through existing ways that you're already consuming and working with ENVI. ENVI Server, I will call out, is an ENVI only. It's not an ENVI Classic piece of functionality. So ENVI Classic, if you're a longtime ENVI user, we haven't done any development for ENVI Classic for a long time. We still have some people out there using ENVI Classic. If you want to access ENVI Server, you have to use new ENVI. So just to talk a little bit about, once you hit run task in the background or run model in the background, what you actually see is something like this pop up within ENVI. You'll see an ENVI Server job console appear. You'll see a little box on the right that's highlighted that says display results. So if you're using ENVI tasks, display results works automatically out of the box. If you're using the ENVI modeler, you need to use the output parameters node, which I'll show here in just a minute, what that actually looks like, just so this functionality all works. Last thing I want to quickly cover before we jump into our use cases and our first demo is as we move forward with new different versions of ENVI or our modules start to get updated, you'll need to make sure that the versions of ENVI Server on any remote machines and your local machine match. So really we're talking about making sure that ENVI, IDL, and any ENVI module versions are the same. So not super important right now, but here in maybe about a month and a half, we're going to have the next release of the ENVI Deep Learning module. So if you're using deep learning with ENVI Server, that'll be a great time to make sure you update on your local machine and your remote machine at the same time. So important as we move forward, not super important right now. But with that, let's take a look at our first use case that we're going to be covering today. So our first use case is pretty simple. We're just talking about being able to multitask within ENVI. So the simple question there is, do you want to do more than one thing at a time in ENVI? So ENVI Server, as we showed already in a couple screenshots, it's seamlessly integrated within ENVI's UI. It's very easy to send processing to the background and keep doing whatever you want to do within desktop ENVI. So with that, let's jump over to our demo. First, got to show a nice little pretty picture, a nice background, keep things light and exciting today. All right, let me move a few things out of my display here and make sure we are good to go. So what we're going to be showing today in ENVI is we're going to be going through a scenario. We're going to find the flooded pixels with a change detection workflow. So this scenario here, it's data from North Carolina in the United States. It's from a couple of years ago when there was pretty significant flooding. And so we're going to go through with change detection to find the water in time 1 and time 2, and then we're going to generate a map where all the water is blue that represents all of the flooded pixels, the new water that's in our scene. So with that, we're going to be using the ENVI modeler. So within the ENVI modeler, hopefully everybody's familiar with this. If you're not, we've got a quick little overview video on our website. It's a really great tool, and it's really the way to use ENVI today. This is how I use ENVI. If I'm using deep learning, I'll either write some IDL code to automate my workflow, or I'll use the ENVI modeler to automate and manage all of my data pre-processing and the training of the neural networks as well. So this is what our ENVI modeler workflow is today that we're going to be running. It's a little bit more complicated than this, and we'll get to that here in just 1 second. So as I called out before, you need to use the output parameters tab, or node, not tab, in the ENVI modeler in order to capture the outputs and be able to visualize them. If I double click on this line connecting this planet flooding, the yellow node, to the pink node that's output parameters, you'll see that I'm capturing the output raster from this workflow that I previously created. Over here on the left, we just have our time 1 image, which is our pre-flood, and our time 2 image, which is post-flood. So all I need to do to run this in the background is I can click on the little drop down next to run and select run model in the background. When I do that, let me close the ENVI modeler for a second, you'll see the ENVI Server job console appears. On this, up at the top, we've got it says queued, meaning that we haven't actually started running our job yet. It'll say that it has been accepted here in just a second. And then over on the right, we'll see progress, or we have a little cancel option because we're not complete yet. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize this, and then I'm going to show you a little bit more about our data and what we expect the results to look like and the ENVI modeler itself. So this is a great example. I'm running processing in ENVI. If I would have just clicked the run button, my ENVI session would be locked. I'd be blocked. I'd be waiting for everything to finish before I could do anything else. So here, just to toggle back and forth between our imagery. So this is our post-flood image. And if I switch back onto the pre-flood, you'll see where there's kind of some fields here that they become very dark where there's water in time 2. So let me switch a few more times, and we'll give GoToWebinar a few seconds here to make sure we stay synced up. And we're really just going to be going through and extracting the places where there's new water, not like where there's the river kind of on the right-hand side. And so with this scenario, what we're actually doing behind the scenes is pretty simple. And I can bring up the ENVI modeler and show you the actual workflow itself. So we're just using ISO data classification to do an unsupervised classification workflow on our image. And the first class that's extracted for time 1 and time 2 corresponds to water. So once we have kind of our water mask for time 1 and time 2, we're really just doing a difference, a change detection to actually extract where there was water in time 2 and not in time 1. So it's pretty easy. It's a very simple workflow. This is something that you can go through ENVI's UI today and the image change workflow and do this yourself. Or as I have here, I made a custom little ENVI modeler workflow that does the same thing as the UI. So if we pop back over to our ENVI modeler, or not ENVI modeler, our ENVI Server job console now, I'll see that detect floods has finished. So if I click on display results, I will see that I have now this nice blue raster overlaid on my image that represents the places where there's new water in time 2 that there wasn't in time 1. So this workflow is something that you could customize. So if you wanted to identify all the water in the scenes, so maybe it's not just where new water is, where things are flooded, but you also care about where there's waters or lakes beforehand. That's something that you could adjust this to do as well. But this is really our first workflow, or not first workflow, our first use case for ENVI Server, where I'm continuing to use ENVI to talk about our scenario, opening up the ENVI modeler while all our processing is happening in the background, and I just wait for it to be done before I do something else. So that's kind of our live demo, not kind of, it is our live demo that we're going to show today. As I called out before, you can check out the What's New webinar with a slightly different live demo and a different kind of introduction for ENVI Server if you're interested. But let's go ahead and pop back to our slides. So give me a second here to bring that back up again. All right. So moving on with our other use cases. So the next one that we're going to jump to is our ENVI programmer use case. So this is one that's probably one of my favorites, apart from the deep learning one, which we'll get to, because I myself am a programmer. So as Bill said, I've got a pretty technical background. I like to use IDL to automate my workflows, especially for deep learning. If I don't use the ENVI modeler, I'll write an IDL script to find all my data, do all my pre-processing, and start training for deep learning. So if you are a programmer, and it's not a requirement, so I'm not trying to scare anybody off by showing a few snippets of code here, but if you are a programmer, it's very, very easy to use ENVI Server. So what I've got here is just a snippet of code that I took from our documentation. On the left, you'll see pre-ENVI 5.6. if you're using the ENVI Task API through IDL, you say what your task is, you specify your inputs, and then you execute the task, you run it to actually get your outputs. So those kind of 3 lines of code represent when I'm opening up a dialog within ENVI, I'm selecting my input data and hitting run. It's a handful of lines of code to do the same thing in an automated fashion with IDL. So at a very, very basic level, if you're using IDL, you can adjust your workflows to look like the code snippet on the right, where we create an ENVI Server object, and we use that ENVI Server object to actually submit our task. And what you'll see down on the bottom is through IDL, we can even register the task that we submit for processing with the ENVI Server job console. So you don't necessarily need to do anything else. You can submit that job, wait for it to finish, and look at the results within ENVI. It's your choice. You have complete control over that. If you are a programmer and you're familiar with the ENVI Task API, there's a lot more that you can do with ENVI Server. So just to show you a little snippet of some advanced usage, where when you submit a task with the ENVI Server API, you can wait for that job to finish. You can check if it's completed or if it's failed, and put in all the custom logic that you want to. This is a great way where you can, fork off different parts of the workflow. So you could maybe submit 4 or 5 rasters for processing, wait for everything to finish, and then move on to the next step of your processing chain. So this is a little bit more advanced usage. We know this isn't for all of our users, but this is a use case that I think is really important to call out, because there's a lot of depth here with ENVI Server, and a lot of ways that you can use it and have fun programming and doing your image processing at the same time. So that's our second use case. Getting back to something that might be a little bit closer to people who aren't programmers, maybe you're a scientist, is our third use case. So if you're someone who's got many large data sets. So this use case I have prefaced with many large data sets for a specific reason. If you're processing large data within desktop ENVI, something that could make 10 minutes, 20 minutes, maybe it takes an hour to actually do your whole processing end-to-end workflow. This is a great candidate for using ENVI Server to push that long-running job to the background, keep using ENVI, or if you've got more than one raster or scene that you need to process, do all of that stuff in parallel. When it comes to modern hardware with lots of CPUs and solid-state drives, this is a great way to take advantage of your fast and beefy machines. So we'll talk about that here in just a second when we get into our details. But for this use case, a little bit more detail is we're going to be walking through how you can save time with ENVI Server processing a time series of Sentinel-2 data. So if you're unfamiliar with us or haven't watched many of our webinars before, most of the people who work at L3 Harris Geospatial are centered in Colorado. So specifically, our office is in Broomfield. We used to be in Boulder, Colorado. So I grabbed 10 Sentinel-2 scenes over kind of the Boulder Front Range area in Colorado in the United States. So might look familiar to you if you're from Colorado or have traveled here before. But for this example, we're looking at 10 Sentinel-2 scenes, and we're going to be calculating 4 spectral indices for each scene. So this isn't some huge, dramatic type of processing here. It's pretty simple and something that we have done before. We're looking at something like a spectral index over time, and you can build like a hyperspectral data cube with a single image over lots of time frames. So basically, if you don't have hyperspectral data, you can kind of simulate it and look at signals over time with 1 or 2 bands as kind of a subset of many scenes. For this, it takes about 5 minutes to actually process each data set that we're looking at. So if we've got 10 scenes, that's going to be about an hour of processing. Before we jump into kind of the results and metrics here, we have about 9 gigabytes of data, and we'll be writing out almost 20 gigabytes of uncompressed binary data to disk. So that's with the ENVI file format. So this is a great candidate to show off, taking advantage of solid state drives and multiple CPUs. So for this, to talk about the results here, so up in the top left, you'll see it takes almost 3,000 seconds, so about 50 minutes of processing if we're not using ENVI Server. When we use ENVI Server, and we're processing 4 images at a time of our 10 images, we get that processing down to about 1,050 seconds, so about 17.5 minutes of processing. So this is a reduction in time by about 65%. So this is a pretty good dramatic time savings that we get here. We don't quite get to 75% time reduction. So let me talk about that for a second. So instead of processing 1 image at a time, we're processing 4 at the same time. If we're doing 4 times the processing, we would expect to take maybe 25% of our time if everything scales linearly. If we're not using more than 100% of our CPU, if we don't have processes fighting for resources or fighting for file IO for reading and writing a bunch of data, ideally our perfect scalability will be 25%. We don't quite get to a reduction of 75%, so we're at 25% of our original time, because we have a mismatch between the number of concurrent processes and the number of data sets that we're processing. So we have 10 total images, so we'll process 4 images at once, 4 images at once, and then at the very end, we'd have 2 images left over, so we're just processing 2 at a time. So if we had 12 images for this scenario, we'd almost be at 75% reduction in time. That's because this process, which I showed and talked about something adjacent to this in the What's New webinar, we get really good scaling. And so just to talk a little bit about my machine here, so it's the same one I'm presenting from today. I'm using 4 concurrent processes with ENVI Server, 12 CPUs, and a solid state drive. So I'm using all of my CPUs when I'm going through. So I'm at almost 100% CPU usage while this is running. So each process is using about 3 of my 12 CPUs. So that's really important, because if I bump this up from 4 to something like 6, I'm probably not going to save any time at all. Just because all my resources, they're going to be colliding a little bit. I'm not going to have enough CPUs for what I really need to get that sort of throughput. But this is a really nice kind of use case. It's simple. We're not doing anything crazy or advanced here. And then just for the pretty picture, if you haven't read ahead, over on the right, once we have all of our spectral indices, we can stack all of that data and we can calculate or run an MNF transform, which stands for minimum noise fraction. And here we have looking at 3 of the bands from our MNF transform, just kind of a crazy little color combination. Pretty picture, something nice to look at. So that's our third kind of use case today, where it's a nice, easy one. We're just processing lots of data in parallel. Our fourth use case, and this is one that is my favorite out of all of these, is talking about data preparation for deep learning. So if you're not aware, we have the ENVI Deep Learning module, which allows you to easily access TensorFlow and image classifications, neural networks, all from within ENVI, and you don't need to program. If you do have a lot of data or custom data preparation, as we talked about with the ENVI Server API, or if you're familiar with the ENVI API in general, IDL has all the tools that you need to create a custom data processing pipeline. And that is what we did for our last use case that we're going to cover. So using ENVI Server with deep learning, really what we're doing is taking, from this slide, we're taking the data on the left. So we have a raster and we have a vector of building footprints, and we're creating the images that you see on the right, where we have an image, we have red outlines, which are all the pixels that represent our buildings, and you'll see we've got white space up in the top right of that image. So we have to basically convert our vector into a raster and make sure to mask out the pixels that are turned off for our image, as well as our training data. So at a high level, that's really what our data preparation looks like for this. But there's also some other pieces, and that's why I really like this example, because it's got, there's a lot to chew on here. So just to talk about this use case, so we've got 72 aerial images. We've got about 10 gigabytes worth of data between 35 and 50 centimeters, and it's all aerial data, different sensors, different locations, different times of year. So it's a great real world scenario for deep learning. For the training data here, we're actually using building footprints data layers that were generated by Microsoft and are publicly available. So there you can find a link to GitHub where you can download and access the building footprints that we used for this use case. we have two separate areas where we actually do some processing. We have to download, prepare the vectors for use, and then we have to get our rasters ready. So this is nice because we could use ENVI Server for both parts of that. So we could download the data sets in parallel and unzip and convert some of these GeoJSON files to shape files all at the same time in the background. Then you'll see all the steps for how we process our raster over on the right-hand side. I'm not going to go into all the details there. If you're curious about other things that happen behind the scenes, you can send us an email and we'll talk about those. But to talk about the results here, so nice little pictures on the right that hopefully aren't too distracting from our metrics over on the left. So this, if we're not using ENVI Server, takes about 1,800 seconds, about 30 minutes to do our end-to-end processing. So that's downloading, preparing all of our vectors, and then processing all 72 images without ENVI Server. If we do use ENVI Server, we can get that processing down to about 700 seconds. So we're at about 11.5 minutes of total processing if we use ENVI Server. And what you'll see over on the right is actually we go through about 4 hours of training with the subset of this data, just to show you, it's not, we're not going through, it's not just some little marketing example. This is a real world scenario of how we internally use our tools with ENVI Server and ENVI Deep Learning to actually generate classifiers for customers and other examples like this. But one thing that you might notice if you're reading the lower left hand of the slide, so I actually used 6 concurrent processes when I was going through and processing all this data. So with the example that was just before using Sentinel-2 data, it's JPEG 2000 data, which is compressed. So there's going to be a little bit more work with my CPU to uncompress that, get that ready for use. All of this data was already binary ENVI formatted files on disk. So with that in mind, and after a little bit of testing, I knew that I could do more than four images at the same time. So we're processing 6 data sets at once for this use case. And this is also a really great one because as you add more data sets, this should scale just the same. So 72 might seem like a lot, 10 gigabytes of data might seem like a lot for deep learning applications, but it's really not. You can end up with hundreds and hundreds of gigabytes of data for training and generating models. And so being able to quickly get through those large volumes of data, start training and spend less time focusing on your data preparation, start to see how your models are performing is really important. So that's why this is a really great use case for ENVI Server, and it's one that I like. I'm also a little biased because I work with ENVI Deep Learning a lot. But so just to summarize, here's the different use cases that we covered and some of the bullets that you saw earlier as we were walking through this. So as Bill mentioned, everybody's going to get a copy of these slides, so no need to read everything or memorize them. You will get those. So then one more slide before we jump to questions and discussion time. We have an upcoming virtual ENVI Analytics Symposium. So this is a conference that we've hosted every year for the past 4 or 5 years. Because of coronavirus and the pandemic, we are virtual this year. So the time zone it's based off of kind of Boulder time, so Mountain Time, and it's a morning event. So if you're coming or joining us from Europe or different parts of the world, it might be difficult for you to attend just based off the time difference, unless you want to be learning about remote sensing and image science, image processing in the middle of the night. Maybe that's what really gets you going. So check out our website for more information and feel free to join and register. We've got a great lineup and some hands-on workshops as well, virtual hands-on, to learn about deep learning and SAR processing. So with that, I think that takes us to the very end.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. That's really great. Thanks for the excellent demonstrations and explanations. Maybe we can go a minute or two over to try to answer some questions. There's a couple of quick ones that came in early. When can I access ENVI Server?
Yeah, great question. So ENVI Server is included with ENVI 5.6. ENVI 5.6, we released that last Monday, Bill. Is that right?
Yes.
So you can, as long as you're current on maintenance, you'll have access to ENVI 5.6. ENVI Server is included. There's one additional piece of software that you'll need to install and set up in order to use ENVI Server, but all that's in the download and licensing center.
Great. So you don't actually have to pay for that as long as you have the maintenance service for ENVI. That's great. ENVI Server comes included. Another quick question, can I use the ENVI modules with ENVI Server?
Yep, that is a great question. So in any license entitlements that you have on your local machine that you're using, you can use with ENVI Server. So if you have the atmospheric correction module or ENVI deep learning or feature extraction, all of that will work seamlessly with ENVI Server. So as long as you've got those license entitlements, you can use them with ENVI Server.
Great. All right. So there's a lot of questions coming in, Zach. I tagged a few of them. I don't know if there's some things you want to try to address there in another minute or two here, and then we'll wrap.
Sure. Here's a good one: is how many CPUs can ENVI Server handle? So ENVI Server is not limited in the number of CPUs that it can actually run with. So like for my machine, and let me hop back a few slides here, just to the deep learning example again. So I have 12 CPUs. So depending on which process I'm running and depending on the process that I'm running is how many CPUs you're actually using. Most ENVI processes, but not all, are probably using somewhere between maybe 1 and 4 CPUs total. So like with the Sentinel 2 scenario, going back again for this, so it's using about 3 CPUs per worker or concurrent process that I'm actually running. So as many CPUs as you have, you can consume with ENVI Server, as long as you've got the number of concurrent processes to support that. One of the things that's really important about performance and trying to scale processing is your disk drive, because we're talking about really large volumes of data. So if I go back one more slide here, we have about 9 gigabytes of compressed data that we're reading. And for this Sentinel 2 scenario, we're writing about 20 gigabytes of data. So there's a lot of data we're reading, a lot of data that we're writing. So it's really important that you have that that really fast solid state drive or RAID set up to increase how fast you can read and write data. That's probably going to be a bigger limiting factor than anything else if you're using ENVI Server and trying to scale your processing, because raster data is big. It's very easy and very common to have images that are over a gigabyte in size. We've got data sets that are upwards of 100 gigabytes, and in that case, file I/O becomes one of your limiting factors.
All right. I think we're kind of coming to the end of our time here. We had allotted 30 minutes for the presentation. Is there any last questions you want to try to address, Zach, or shall we wrap?
It's probably a good idea to wrap up.
Okay.
Questions, people can reach out to us or your distributor, and we can get those answered.
Right. We will, as I said earlier, we are recording this, and in the next couple of days, we'll post that on our website, and we'll send you an email with the link to the recording as well as the slides from the presentation. So, and we will try to, after the fact, answer some of these questions to folks, for the ones that we didn't get to answer here directly today. So thanks for joining us, and I hope the presentation was helpful. Bye now.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you later.